Slavery had a price for a strong back. It had almost no answer for an old one. So what happened when an enslaved person lived long enough to stop making money for the plantation? That question is almost never the one people ask. We talk about the whip, the auction block, the field, the escape, the war, but there is another question sitting underneath all of it, and it is just as revealing. What did a slave society do with the people whose bodies it had already spent? Picture an elderly black woman, somewhere in her 60s, maybe older. No official record would help us. Her back is bent forward from decades of work. Her fingers are swollen and locked half shut from arthritis. Her knees give way without warning. For 40 years, the plantation knew exactly what she was worth. It could count her in rows hoed, fires built, pounds picked, children carried, meals cooked. And then one day, it couldn't. That is where the mask slips. Because the entire logic of American slavery was built on output, not personhood, not dignity, not old age. Output. Your value was measured in what your body could still be forced to produce, so when the body started failing, the system faced a problem it never had a moral answer for. Only a financial one. And the answer, depending on the plantation, was anything from calculated repurposing to slow abandonment. First, something people often do not realize: enslaved people did grow old. Not most, not comfortably, not safely. The violence, disease, overwork, hunger, exposure, and lack of medical care made old age far from guaranteed. But some people survived into their 60s, their 70s, even beyond. They survived because human beings are harder to erase than systems expect. They survived because enslaved communities carried one another. They survived because people kept choosing life inside a world designed to grind it down. But surviving long enough to become old did not mean the system suddenly became humane. It meant the system had to decide what to do with a body it could no longer fully exploit. On some plantations, especially larger ones with more labor to redistribute, elderly enslaved people were kept alive and assigned what owners like to call light work. That phrase deserves suspicion. Light work could mean rocking white children to sleep while your own children had been sold away. It could mean tending a kitchen fire with smoke burning your lungs. It could mean mending clothes with hands so stiff they could barely grip a needle. It could mean watching toddlers in the quarters while everyone else was driven into the fields before sunrise. This was not mercy, it was cost management. Older enslaved woman could still supervise children, shell peas, carry water, stir kettles, or keep a fire going. Then she still had use. Not freedom, not comfort, use. The plantation had already extracted her prime years. Now it tried to squeeze whatever remained. Sometimes owners turned that arrangement into theater. Visitors would be shown an elderly man or woman sitting outside a cabin, wrapped in a worn shawl, no longer in the fields. And the slaveholder would treat that image as proof of kindness. Look, they implied. I do not discard my old servants. I care for them. The standard was so depraved that simply not throwing a person away could be advertised as benevolence. But the performance hid the truth. That elder was not being honored. That elder was being displayed. Their survival was being used to polish the conscience of the person who owned them. And the older people understood that. They knew when they were being turned into evidence for someone else's virtue. They also knew their food, shelter, and safety still depended on that same person's mood. There is a special cruelty in being forced to serve as a prop for your own oppressor. Not every plantation even bothered with the performance. Some owners applied the same cold arithmetic to old enslaved people that they applied to worn-out livestock or broken tools.
If a person could no longer do profitable labor, the question became brutally simple. Could anything else still be extracted? Sometimes the answer was a sale. An elderly enslaved person at auction might bring almost nothing. $1, a few dollars, barely the price of a meal, after a lifetime that had generated enormous wealth for someone else. Think about the obscenity of that collapse. Decades of stolen labor, reduced at the end to pocket change. Who bought someone at that price? Sometimes a smaller farmer who wanted one more body for the lightest chores. Sometimes a speculator gambling on a few leftover years of labor. Sometimes a buyer who intended to free the person because the purchase was cheap and the gesture carried moral or religious weight. And sometimes nobody wanted them. That is where the story gets even darker. Because abandonment under slavery did not always look dramatic. Often it looked administrative, quiet, plausibly deniable. An older person might be moved to the worst cabin. Their food might shrink from meager to starvation level. Medical attention, already scarce, would be reserved for younger workers whose bodies still represented profit. No announcement, no written order, no public scene. Just a gradual withdrawal of the bare minimum needed to stay alive. A sentence delivered in increments. People who had survived the auction block, the whipping post, childbirth, disease, and 40 harvests could find themselves facing the cruelest verdict of all: you have outlived your profitability. Some formerly enslaved people later described watching elders decline this way, not because age itself had defeated them, but because the plantation had decided they were no longer worth feeding properly. That memory stayed with survivors for the rest of their lives, not just because it was sad, because it revealed the system with terrifying clarity. If slavery could not use your body, slavery was prepared to let you die. And yet, this is the part the plantation never fully controlled. The owners could assign value. They could not force enslaved people to share that value system. Again and again, the historical record points to the same defiant pattern. When the plantation treated elders as depleted assets, the enslaved community treated them as human beings whose importance had not ended. Younger people shared food they did not have to spare. Women who had already worked exhausting days in the fields came back at night and cooked for elders who could no longer stand over a pot. Children were sent to carry water, gather kindling, and sit with the old people in the quarters so they would not be alone. Roofs were patched, fires were kept, medicines were mixed, stories were listened to. This was not a sentimental extra. It was a different moral universe. Many enslaved people carried cultural traditions shaped by West and Central African ideas that regarded elders as keepers of memory, wisdom, warning, lineage, and spiritual continuity. The plantation saw a body past its economic peak. The community saw somebody who still held things the plantation could not manufacture. Memory, names, kinship, buried history. In a world where literacy was often forbidden, and families were constantly broken by sale, elderly people became living archives. They remembered who belonged to whom. They remembered marriages that had never been legally recognized, children who had been sold south, mothers who disappeared after an auction, fathers whose names survived only because an old person kept repeating them. That kind of memory was power. If a young person wanted to know where they came from, the old people often knew. If a mother wanted her child to remember an aunt sold away 15 years earlier, the old people kept that memory alive. If a family line had been split and scattered across counties or states, the old people could still name the links. The plantation's books treated people as inventory. The elders kept a rival record in human memory. And they did more than remember. On large plantations, older women were often assigned to watch very young children while parents worked. That arrangement was chosen for labor efficiency, but it created something the plantation could not fully understand. Those elderly women became the emotional and cultural bridge for an entire generation. They taught children what danger looked like, how to read a white person's face before a mood became violence, which paths were safer after dark, which plants could soothe a fever or upset a stomach, which songs carried more than one meaning, which names belonged to them before the plantation tried to flatten everyone into ownership. They also taught tenderness inside a system built to weaponize attachment. They held babies while mothers were in the fields. They soothed terrified children through the long hours before sunset. They became grandmother figures in a world where actual grandparents had often been sold away, beaten down, or buried without markers. That labor was invisible to the ledger, but it was central to the survival of a people. The same was true of healing. On most plantations, white physicians were rare, expensive, and often dangerous. 19th-century medicine could mean bleeding, mercury, crude surgery, and treatments that harmed as often as they helped. So enslaved communities built and preserved their own medical knowledge, and older women and men were often the ones carrying it. They knew which bark could bring down a fever, which roots eased pain, which poultices helped burns, which herbs steadied childbirth, how to clean a wound, how to set a bone as best they could with what little they had. This was learned knowledge, tested across generations, held mostly in memory, and passed hand to hand, voice to voice. And it made elders indispensable in ways the slave economy was too crude to measure. The person who could help your child survive the night was not useless. The person who knew what plant might stop a cough from becoming a burial was not disposable. Older people also anchored spiritual life. In secret meetings in cabins, in the woods, beside dying fires, elders led prayers, retold scripture through the lens of bondage and deliverance, and preserved spiritual practices that official white religion either distorted or tried to erase. They helped people bury the dead with dignity when formal rites were denied. They carried the belief that suffering was being witnessed, that pharaohs fell, that earthly masters were not the final authority over the soul. That kind of faith was not escapism. It was endurance technology. Young people looked at elders who had survived decades of captivity and saw something powerful: proof. If she could survive this long, then maybe I can survive this night.
He is still standing. Maybe this system is not as total as it wants to appear. But then freedom came, and for many elderly people, freedom arrived with a cruel twist. For a young adult, emancipation at least held the possibility of movement, waged work, searching for family, building something new. But for somebody whose body had already been broken by a lifetime of forced labor, freedom often meant entering the world with nothing at exactly the moment they had the least physical ability to recover. No savings, no land, no pension, no compensation. No legal recognition that anything had been stolen at all. Some elderly formerly enslaved people stayed on the very plantations where they had been owned, now as sharecroppers, servants, or dependents under conditions barely distinguishable from the old order. Others were taken in by relatives, church members, or neighbors who continued the older tradition of communal care. Black churches and mutual aid networks did what they could. The Freedmen's Bureau offered some help, but far too little, for far too short a time, against need that was overwhelming. The country had taken their strength. It did not intend to fund their old age. That is one of the most revealing facts in American history. A nation built on enslaved labor reached the end of slavery and still found no serious national answer for the people whose bodies had financed so much of its wealth. And then, decades later, something extraordinary happened. Some of those same people lived long enough to testify. In the 1930s, interviewers working for the Federal Writers Project sat down with elderly black Americans who had been born into slavery. By then, many were in their 70s, 80s, or 90s. Their memories reached back into a world that much of the country was already busy romanticizing, softening, and lying about. And when those elders felt safe enough to speak honestly, what they gave the nation was priceless. Not because the stories were clean, because they were not. They spoke about hunger, beatings, sale, terror, family separation, humiliation, and exhaustion. But they also spoke about songs, jokes, gardens, prayers, shared food, stolen tenderness, and the fragile acts of care that kept people human in a machine designed to deny their humanity. Without those elders, we would know vastly less than we do. The official record did not care much about old enslaved people. Planters tracked production, punishment, transactions, births, deaths, and ownership. They did not preserve the interior lives of people they considered spent. So the people the system treated as used up became, in the end, some of the most important witnesses we have. The one slavery marked as worthless turned out to be historically invaluable. They survived long enough to expose it. And that leaves us with a question that is bigger than the 19th century. What does a society reveal when it ties human value too tightly to productivity? Slavery gave one brutal answer: when your labor ended, your value, in the eyes of the system, collapsed with it. The enslaved community gave another answer: when your labor ended, your meaning did not. In some ways, it deepened. You became memory keeper, childminder, healer, prayer leader, witness. Proof that a human being is more than the output a market can extract from a body. That is not just history, it is a warning, because every society says, in one way or another, what it thinks an old person is worth. And the distance between what we claim to believe and how we actually treat the elderly can still be disturbingly wide. The people who endured slavery into old age deserved more than survival, they deserved rest. Safety, honor, repair. They were denied all of it by the people who profited most from them. But they still left behind something slavery failed to kill: the truth. And if we are willing to listen, that truth is still asking the same devastating question. What do you do with a human being once you can no longer turn their body into profit?